talking about these disorders. So the first thing that we have to understand is when we talk about the fact that we're talking about abnormal psychology, we have to look at the different ways that we can define abnormality. And the fact is that there are a lot of different ways that we can define abnormality. The word normal itself comes from the word norm, which in a statistical sense is the average. If you are the median, you are the norm. Now, in that case, people who have extremely high IQs would be considered abnormal because they're outside of the normal range. Okay, that middle part of the bell curve, you're outside of that, you're abnormal. And we don't technically like using that as a way of being able to define normality or abnormality. So we have to use a couple of other ways that we can define these things. Okay. The next is an adequacy approach. We look at how people are able to function on a daily basis in their lives. Can they feed themselves? Can they clothe themselves? Can they take care of themselves? Can they do their job? Can they do their job without undue wear and tear on themselves physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically? The problem with defining normality and abnormality in that way comes from the idea that as we progress through our lives, demands on us change. For example, you might be getting B's in high school, but then you get to college and you're getting D's and F's. What has changed? Ultimately, nothing, except for the fact that you've progressed. You've gone to another area of existence. You do not have a mental disorder because you are unable to succeed in that atmosphere. You're just struggling and you need some extra help. So adequacy isn't a great way of defining what abnormality is. We could define it through a person's discomfort, okay? Whether they are angry or anxious or happy or sad or whatever, a person could be experiencing distress. But here's the thing, and this is a question that I pose to everybody, not just the live people, but also the people here in the chat window. Have you ever, I don't want to say hidden, but have you ever kind of suppressed what you were feeling at some moment emotionally so that people would just leave you alone? Is that something that you've done? Yeah, we all do that. So the problem with personal discomfort as a definition of what is normal or abnormal comes from the fact that, guess what? You don't know what's going on inside my head, which is probably for the best. But it also can be hidden. Okay, I can deceive you into thinking, yeah, everything's fine with this guy when my world is falling apart completely. So we overlook people who don't seem like they're under a lot of stress or having a difficult time. And we might not be able to identify them as someone who needs additional help. So that doesn't work as a definition of abnormal. Bizarreness, okay? People who are extremely eccentric or exhibit bizarre behaviors, they could be labeled as abnormal. But here's the thing. For poor people, those people might get help, mental help. For wealthy people, they don't need mental help. They're just eccentric. They just do weird things. That's fine. Okay. No, it's not fine. They're having a mental breakdown. Have any of you ever been to the Winchester House up in San Jose? Okay. Anybody in the online class been to the Winchester House? Anybody ever heard of the Winchester House? Kind of. The story behind the house is Winchester was the guy who invented the repeat action rifle. So it was basically a gun you could keep firing without having to reload. And when he died, he left his fortune to his wife. And his wife went a little, this isn't a technical term, but cuckoo bananas. And she basically believed that the people who were killed by her husband's invention were haunting her. And so she built a house in San Jose, California, which you can go and visit today. It's really, really cool. It's kind of expensive, but it's really cool to walk around in this house. And it's a house that was always under construction. And she built the house specifically to trick the spirits so that they couldn't find her. So there were hundreds of rooms in this house because they were always adding more rooms. There were stairways that went to nothing. There was a doorway that basically it was like a doorway off of your living room where if you open it, you just kind of walk out into nothing and you fall down 2 stories. It's a really, really cool house. But this woman was acting bizarrely. This is an example of bizarreness being a indication of mental health. But because she was rich, people just went, sure, I'll build another room onto your house. How many more rooms do you want? I want 1 room a day until I die. You got it. And so she was constantly doing and building more onto this house, and stairs that went nowhere and all this other kind of stuff. It's really, 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 really crazy. Okay. But that's not a particularly good definition for normal or abnormal when we talk about mental health, because of the fact that, well, she was wealthy and it wasn't a problem. So what's the big deal? Another way that we can define normal and abnormal is through cultural means. Now, this is a particularly troubling way to define what is normal and abnormal, because who's to say our culture is correct? Now, we would say our culture is correct, but people who are coming from outside of our culture would go, no, that's really weird. You totally shouldn't do that. For example, in the cultural model, in Western culture and our American culture, it is absolutely horrible and abhorrent for people to have sexual relationships with children. That's not okay. That is abnormal. There's something wrong with you according to our society. But in other parts of the world, not only is that encouraged, it's welcomed with open arms. Of course, that's a good idea. So we can't say that mental health can be looked at culturally, but it is something that we have to think about when it comes to the idea of normal or abnormal. Okay, so when we look at mental health and how to define what mental health is and is not, we have to take into account all of these things. It isn't just a statistical model, because again, then geniuses would be considered abnormal and we should treat them because they're not mentally healthy. Adequacy can't be seen as normal or abnormal on its own, because again, you could be just having a bad day that day. Doesn't mean you're mentally ill. Personal discomfort. People are good at hiding their true feelings and emotions, so we can't use that. Bizarreness. Well, we've just shown that people who are wealthy will never be mentally ill. And there's a lot of very mentally ill, wealthy people out there. A lot of them. They're weirdos. And then, of course, the cultural model, where it's only abnormal if your society rejects it. Well, societies and cultures change over time, so what's to say that this is going to be something that we're not going to experience in the future? Well, in order to be able to have something that defines abnormality for us, the American Psychological Association, the APA, created this book, The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and they started doing that in 1952. The very first DSM came out in 1952. And basically what they did was they classified and specified what each mental health issue was. So they classified and characterized mental illness so that everybody would be diagnosed in the same way. What they were finding in the 1950s, yeah, don't read it. You'll just simply have all of the problems, and we'll get to what that is in just a couple of minutes. Anyway, what they have found is that in the 1940s and 1950s, early 1950s, was that psychologists from place to place were diagnosing people differently. What one psychologist might say is, oh, that's bipolar. Another psychiatrist go, no, that is schizophrenia. So this was a way of being able to standardize people's diagnoses so that we could really, truly understand what people were experiencing. Okay. Again, the first DSM came out in 1952, and over the course of the next 60 years, it's been revised 5 times. We are currently on DSM-5. DSM-5 came out, I want to say like 2008. And every time they come out with a new DSM, psychologists from around the country and around the world sit down and they decide what's going to go in, what's going to be taken out, how things are going to be adjusted. And then those things are then studied over and over and over again. And then in 20 or so years, they revise it again. So the first one came out in 1952. I think the second one came out in 1972. Then I think there was another one in 1980 something, and then 90, I want to say 97. It doesn't matter what year they came out in. Just understand that it changes over time. Now, in the original DSM, there were a lot of things in there that today are not considered mental illness. For example, homosexuality was considered a mental illness in the original DSM. When they came back to revise it in the 1970s, a large number of psychologists who were gay kind of pushed the APA into abandoning that position. And there was a lot of reasons for that. Okay. But these things do come and go. One thing that they've looked at adding as a mental disorder is gaming addiction. Okay. So like video game addiction. It didn't get added this last time, but maybe in the next one, when they study it a little bit more and they actually see it as a mental disorder, they will put it in there. They probably won't. It's not a mental disorder. You just like playing games because of the dopamine hit that you get from winning. That's why good games, you're constantly winning, especially the handheld games. Yeah, they're really good at manipulating our dopamine systems into, ooh, I won. I want to keep playing this. Anyway, in the DSM, each mental disorder is characterized and categorized into a set of kind of overarching disorders. They then have in for each entry, a set of primary and secondary characteristics of that particular disorder. Now, later this week or next, we're going to have a practice at creating a DSM entry. Okay. And you're going to have to basically create a system to diagnose somebody as having a particular mental disorder. But again, we'll talk about that later in the unit. No, stupid. I didn't ask you. I don't know what Bixby's wake word is, but I keep saying it. I don't know. Anyway, the primary and secondary characteristics are then used to be able to diagnose people. So if you match the primary characteristics and some of the secondary characteristics, you can be securely diagnosed as having that particular mental disorder. Similarly, they also put other problems, other mental health issues that could be similar to it, so that you could go, oh, maybe it's not, bipolar. Maybe it's, oh, this is a depressive disorder. Oh, okay. So instead of being bipolar diagnosed, you get diagnosed as having a major depression. It's a way of being able to specify and really understand each of the mental disorders. So yeah, that's how we diagnose people in the field of psychology. Now, one of the questions that came up in the last period is the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. A psychologist is a person who studies psychology, gets usually a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in psychology, and has a private practice as a therapist. A psychiatrist gets that degree in psychology and then goes to medical school. Psychiatrists are the only psychologists who can prescribe medication. So if you go to a therapist, to a psychologist, and they say, no, you are definitely bipolar and we should probably get you on some meds, they have to refer you to a psychiatrist so that they can look at it and go, yep, you're bipolar, and here's a medication that's going to help you with your bipolarness. Okay, so a psychiatrist not only diagnoses, but prescribes drugs, and a psychologist, they just do the therapy. Okay. All right. So let's start taking a look at some examples of some mental disorders. Okay. And we're going to start with the category of anxiety. Now, anxiety disorders all share a very common thread. They are characterized by excessive fear. Now, when we say excessive fear, we're talking about fear well beyond a rational expectation of fear. Other characterizations of anxiety disorders include worry, mood swings, headaches, weakness, fatigue, or feeling that you're in danger. Now, anxiety and fear are good things to have when it's absolutely necessary to do that. For example, a dangerous situation. Okay, it is good to have fear in a dangerous situation. It is self-preservation. Okay, if I didn't have fear standing next to the edge of a cliff, I might slip and fall and die. Okay, if I didn't have excessive fear when, doing something with gunpowder, I could accidentally light it off and kill myself because I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't, quote unquote, respect it enough. But the problem with anxiety disorders is that it goes far beyond the fear that keeps us alive, but it's the fear that keeps us from living. And you'll see a couple of examples of that in just a second. So typically, anxiety disorders are things that are excessive amounts of worrying, mood swings, headaches, weakness. All these different characteristics kind of fall into these different types. And we'll look at a couple of specific examples here in just a second. Okay. Some of the examples of anxiety that we're going to take a look at: generalized anxiety disorder, phobic disorders, panic disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So each of these are under the anxiety umbrella of the DSM. Okay. The first one that we're going to talk about is generalized anxiety disorder. Now, you remember when I said don't diagnose yourself? Well, about 4 years ago, 4 years ago. Maybe it was only 3 years ago. No, it was 3 years ago. That's right. So 3 years ago, it doesn't matter. 3 or 4 years, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I was giving this exact presentation and realizing that I have all of these symptoms. I was experiencing panic attacks. My panic attacks I described them as slow motion. It was a slow motion panic attack. And if you've ever experienced a panic attack, you know that they are extremely unpleasant. Typically, it involves chest pain, difficulty breathing. Sometimes you might start shaking. My panic attacks basically manifested themselves as if I felt like somebody was pushing their thumb right into the center of my chest and just kind of gently pushing me into my chair. I just always felt like I had pressure on my chest. And it wasn't that I was having trouble breathing, but I don't think I was breathing normally. This would happen to me basically every single day on my ride home from work. So I'd be driving home and I would just feel like somebody was just pushing their thumb ever so gently into my chest and keeping me in my seat in my car. It also made me believe that I was having a heart attack. And I kept checking myself in the rearview mirror to see if I was turning gray, because that's one of the signs that you're having a heart attack, because your blood isn't moving as well as it should because your heart is struggling. So I kept looking in the rearview mirror to see if I had turned gray. And I kept not, I'm like, I'm not gray, so I shouldn't go to the hospital. I feel like I'm having a heart attack. And my wife, in order to help me, bought me like a smartwatch, and it could take your heart rate. And if I ever felt like I was, feeling like I was having a heart attack, I would check my heart rate to see what it was at that moment. The thing that brought this all to a head was my wife decided that I needed to take a break and we needed to go and see a movie. And so we went to see the Han Solo movie. I remember it because I didn't make it through the movie. About, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes into the movie, I felt hot. It was just like suddenly somebody had cranked the heat up in the movie theater. And I'm just like, why is it so hot in here? And my wife says, I'm freezing. I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, that's weird. And I checked my watch. I checked my heart rate on my watch, and my heart rate was at, I believe, about 130. Resting heart rate is about 60. 130 is you've been running. And for the previous 45 minutes, I had been sitting in this movie theater. But my heart rate was exploding. I left the movie theater to get kind of out of the theater. I thought I'd feel better if I went to the bathroom, and it wouldn't go away. I ended up going to the hospital that night to see if I was actually having a heart attack. And I got to the emergency room. They brought me in. They did a couple of tests, and they're like, you're not having a heart attack. Your heartbeat is perfectly fine. And I remember looking at them going, I'm not fine. I feel like I've got an elephant sitting on my chest right now. And the doctor basically looked at me and said, are you under a lot of stress? And the answer to that question was, hell yes. If it was 4 years ago, my wife was 8 months pregnant. If it was only 3 years ago, I had less than a 1-year-old. I believe this was also around the time when the shooting happened over at Highlands, and everybody panicked that day. That was a really bad day for me, stress-wise. It was really, really bad. But then this doctor basically said, you might want to go and see somebody about this. And that's when I got my generalized anxiety disorder diagnosed. Okay. It was very, very difficult. I was having trouble making decisions. I was having trouble with my family. I don't want to say yelling at my wife, but I can be very, very short with people very quickly. And it can feel like I'm yelling at you when I'm not actually yelling. You'll know when I'm yelling. I don't usually yell. But she was, frustrated with that because she always felt like I was yelling at her. I was suffering from large amounts of physical problems, reduced appetite. I just wasn't very hungry very often. And when I had really bad indigestion. I was eating Tums, okay, the little tablets for indigestion. I was eating them like they were candy. I bought like a big box of them or a bottle of them at Costco, and I finished the bottle. And I still felt like my insides were eating their way out. Okay. Basically, what it was this feeling of generalized anxiety. I was worried about everything, and I couldn't do anything about anything. Luckily for me, I was able to get some assistance. And I have got my stress somewhat under control. However, when stress does come back to get at me, I recognize it a lot easier now. And I know how to get around it. I just have to keep moving forward and not worry too much about it. For example, Saturday, I took a 4-hour test. Okay. Not fun. 4-hour test. And if I don't pass this test, I don't get to graduate. I can retake the test, but I have to wait to graduate officially. I just want this over with. So that was a lot of stress. Friday night, I went to bed at 8 o'clock. Which is very uncharacteristic of me. I'm usually up until about midnight or 1 o'clock, especially on a Friday. I don't have to be at work the next day. But that night, I was just exhausted at 8 o'clock. I'm like, I'm going to bed. Okay. It was the stress. I was feeling that anxiety. I was able to recognize it. I was able to do something about it. Another disorder out there are phobic disorders. Now, we all have phobias about things. We all have things we just don't like. We don't want to be around them. You know, for some people it's spiders, for some people it's snakes, for some people it's water, whatever. We all have little phobias. A phobic disorder takes that phobia and cranks it all the way to 11. Okay. It makes it so that it is extremely loud. Okay. The best example of a phobic disorder that I can give to you is I had a student. I think this was back in 2007. So this was one of my very first years teaching. And I had this girl, she was in my psychology class, and she was also in my AP US history class. And she had a severe phobia of spiders. Okay. Arachnophobia cranked all the way up to the point where somebody drew a spider on one of her papers once when she told them, yeah, I have a severe phobia of spiders. Like, oh, that's funny. Ha ha ha. And they drew a little drawing of a spider. Not a good one. It didn't look realistic in the slightest. This girl clenched up and was in a full-blown panic attack because of somebody drawing a spider on her paper. We couldn't say the word spider, or she would go into this panic attack mode. So we all, as a class, agreed not to say spider, but instead to call them cookies. Well, one day, and she sat right up against the wall in the classroom here. And I remember looking up and seeing her. She was talking to one of her friends. She was okay. Everything was great, except there was a spider crawling down the wall. And I knew that this was not a good thing. So what did I do? I told her friend who she was sitting next to, I looked at her, I said, hey, Nicole, did you catch that cookie? Kind of hinting at looking at the wall. And I remember Nicole looked at me like I had lost my damn mind. It was like, no, what cookie? I don't know what you're talking about. And then suddenly the light clicked on for her. And she's like, oh, a cookie. And she looked behind her at the wall and immediately, hey, Sarah, let's go over here for a second. The second that Sarah stood up, she realized what was going on and her whole body tensed. She started crying and she bolted for the door. That is a phobic disorder. That goes beyond a phobia. Phobias, you can deal with phobias. But this phobic disorder can take over your entire life and can make it so that you can't do things. You can't function normally. That's the difference between a simple phobia and a phobic disorder. Okay. They are intense, irrational fears blown way out of proportion to the actual threat. Okay. The spider that was crawling down the wall, not poisonous, not going to bite her. Okay. Not big enough for that. But she was still deathly afraid of it. Okay. Drawing of the spider on her paper. Absolutely no threat to her. She was still afraid of it. Okay. So that is phobic disorders. Okay. All right. So next up are panic disorders. Panic disorders are members of the anxiety family as well. They are usually coupled with severe panic attacks. Okay. It is a feeling of sudden, helpless terror, often accompanied by an overpowering sense of impending doom or death. Those who suffer from panic disorders usually experience their first attack after a particularly stressful event. Symptoms for this can include choking, faintness, difficulty breathing, nausea, chest pain. There's lots and lots of different things that can happen because of this. Some of you may have experienced a panic attack at some point in your life. Some super stressful event took place and you were, kind of suddenly unable to do anything, really. Okay. So that is what a panic attack is. It basically feels like you're having a full-blown heart attack, except everything's fine. It's just in your head, which is really frustrating because you really want there to be something wrong so that you don't look like you're crazy. I was really hoping I was having a heart attack that night at the movie theater. I mean, I didn't want one, obviously, but I also didn't want to be, no, you're fine. It's all in your head. I don't know how to deal with that. Okay. But that was a particularly bad year for me. Like, bad to the point where I was really, really thinking hard about leaving teaching because it was just getting to be too much. But here I am, almost cured. Anyway, yeah. Ooh, another example of a panic disorder, a panic attack. I don't remember. I don't know if you remember this, but I think was it last year or was it 2 years ago? When the person lit off the fireworks at the football game, was that 2 years ago, or was that just last year? Yeah, there was a person lit off a big firework, and it scared a lot of people. One person was actually having a full-blown panic attack because, and rightfully so, they were scared out of their mind. Okay, that is an example of that. Some kind of stressful event happens and it triggers these feelings of there's nothing I can do, and it just kind of spreads and gets bigger very, very quickly. And that person basically, tenses up and starts shaking, and it starts getting really not good. All right. Next disorder in the anxiety disorder realm is obsessive compulsive. Now, this is typically one of those disorders that tends to get, I don't want to say made fun of, but it tends to be used as a plot device for a lot of people. And then people will start using it like, oh yeah, I like having things, cleaned up. I'm obsessive compulsive. That's not what that is. Okay. You're just nitpicky. You're fine. Okay. In this case, obsessive compulsive is a very, very serious disorder, and it can be realistically described by the two words in its title. The first is an obsession. Obsession is a thought that gets stuck in your head and just doesn't go away. It just keeps coming back over and over and over again. Your brain just keeps repeating that thought over and over again. We have all had obsessive thoughts at some point in our lives. The problem comes when the person starts to try to relieve the stress of those obsessive thoughts, leads them to perform irrational acts. Okay. Generally, they form these little rituals. Okay. They form a ritual around the obsessive thought and the compulsion to relieve their anxiety. They feel better after they've done their secret little ritual. Okay. Now, the best example that I can give you of this was a girl that I worked with when I worked at a restaurant when I was in high school. I remember the day that she told me about it. I was on my lunch break. I was in this back room having, some food. And she came into the back room to sit down and have her food because she was on her lunch break. And she sits down, or before she sits down, she brings in napkins and she starts unfolding her napkins and placing them in this very specific way. And I remember looking at her going, "Why are you doing that?" And she said, "Oh, I just have to, because, I want to, keep my food. I want my food clean." And I was the busser. So I had just cleaned that table and wiped it down with bleachy water. There was nothing alive on that tabletop. I can guarantee that. But she still did that. And I went, I wiped it down, right? I am a good busser. You don't have to do that. And she's like, no. I have to. And then she went and got her plate and she put her plate on the napkin. And then she started telling me about, she felt bad that I was, being made upset because, she was questioning my ability to bus tables. So she explained it to me. She's like, I have obsessive compulsive. I'm like, oh, okay. And then she proceeded to tell me about how she has these thoughts about germs, that she was extremely germophobic. And in order to relieve the stress and anxiety of the idea that germs and viruses are literally everywhere, she has to do certain things. And they all centered around the number 3. Okay. That was her number. And obsessive compulsives typically have a specific number that they do. Okay. They have, it's usually an odd number because they'll if it's an even number, they'll never turn the lights on. But anyway, what she did was she took 3 napkins and laid them out because if her plate touched the table then contaminated her plate and her food. And I'm like, you do know that that's not how germs work, right? She's like, yes, I do, but I also don't care. Okay. She told me that when she gets home and she turns on the lights in her room, she has to flip the light switch 3 times. And when leaving, she has to turn it on and off the light switch 3 times. She said the first table that she sits when she seats a table, because she was a hostess, was table 3. And if table 3 was already taken, table 6. And if 6 was taken, table 9. And if not 9, then 12, then 15. And she just kept going through until she got to something that was divisible by 3. She just had to do that in order to feel comfortable. When she got glasses out of the racks of glasses that that come out of the dishwasher, she would always pick the third one over, third one back. That would be the glass that she would use. What if there wasn't a glass there? She would put glasses. She would fill the entire thing so that she could take 3 and 3 and get her cup. Obsessive compulsive is oftentimes used as a lame plot device in TV shows and soap operas and things like that. But you have to remember, there are real people behind these things, people whose lives are, I don't want to say completely ruined, but people whose lives are disrupted by these irrational thoughts and actions. Okay. Another example that I can bring up is there was a TV show many years ago. It was an intervention. Anyway, it was on A&E, and they had this episode where they're talking to two people who had obsessive compulsive. One of them, their obsessive thoughts revolved around something bad happening whenever they saw an El Camino. Now, for those of you who don't know what an El Camino is, it is a car with a pickup bed in the back. They were really popular in the 60s and 70s, but honestly, they're the dumbest idea for an automobile ever, because you want the car, but you also want the pickup bed. But it's a car, so it can't really haul that much. What the hell's the purpose of this thing? Just buy a pickup truck. No. I want a car. Doesn't make any sense. Anyway, this guy had obsessive thoughts about them. And if he saw one, it was almost like, some people with like a black cat crossing their path. He had to wipe off the El Camino. And he would sit there and do these hand movements, getting rid of the El Camino, trying to wipe it off of him. It made it so that he couldn't hold down a job, because if he were walking to his job and an El Camino drove by, he had to turn around and go home to wipe off the El Camino. Okay, his life was being disrupted by this. Now, where does obsessive compulsive come from? Well, realistically, we don't know. What we do know is that it could have a genetic basis. Like many of these disorders that we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks, if your parents have it, you have a higher probability of getting it yourself. Okay. In this case, it goes from a 1 in 100 chance to a 1 in 10 chance. So it's not like you're gonna get it. You just have a higher probability of it. Okay. Just like pretty much everything else that we've talked about so far. Okay. All right. So let's leave anxiety disorders behind and move on to psychosomatic and somatoform disorders. Okay. Psychosomatic disorders are fairly simple to understand. They involve real, identifiable physical illnesses that are caused by stress and anxiety that you are experiencing. Psychosomatic disorder, a panic attack is basically a psychosomatic disorder. It is one that is real and identifiable, but it's caused by stress and anxiety. It's all inside your head. A somatoform disorder, on the other hand, symptoms appear that are not characteristic of any readily identifiable disease, meaning there is no organic cause to them. Now, there are two types of somatoform disorder. We've got conversion disorder, which we'll talk about in just a second, and hypochondriasis, which we'll also talk about here in just a second. You probably know hypochondriasis a little bit better by its street name, hypochondria. Hypochondria is something that we kind of all experience over the course of our lives at some point. We will all be hypochondriacs about something. But again, we'll talk about that in a second. All right. So what are conversion disorders? A conversion disorder is where you take some kind of emotional or psychological difficulty and you apply it to a part of your body and it stops functioning. Okay. So your hand will suddenly have no feeling. Your leg won't work. Okay. Another example from an episode of King of the Hill. Hank Hill Hank goes and he walks in on his mom and her new boyfriend bumping uglies and goes hysterically blind. Okay, that is a conversion disorder. He took the emotional difficulty of knowing that his mother was a sexual creature and converted it into going blind. There was nothing wrong with his eyes. There was nothing wrong with his brain. There was nothing wrong with his optic nerve. There was nothing wrong. And yet he still could not see. Okay. That is a conversion disorder. Okay. There's no physical damage in the body whatsoever, but suddenly you're suffering from some kind of disorder. Okay. Another example of this is what they call glove anesthesia. In glove anesthesia, your hand goes numb. You can't feel it. You can't move it. It just no longer functions. But the way that our nervous system works, that's impossible. You can't do that. The way that your nerves go down to your fingertips and curve around and come back up your arm, if something is wrong with your hand, there's going to be something wrong with your arm as well. Okay? You won't be able to feel your arm. They're intertwined. But people who are converting their psychological trauma into glove anesthesia, they can feel their arm just fine. Yeah, everything's fine. I feel it. I feel it. I feel it. I don't feel it anymore. I don't feel anything. There's nothing there. I can't move my hand. Again, that's an impossibility. It is a conversion disorder. Okay. Another type is where somebody gets a conversion disorder and their legs are paralyzed. And yet they can sometimes be seen sleepwalking in the night. Your legs aren't paralyzed now, are they? Okay. So there's something wrong. We've got to figure that out. Hypochondria, or its more fancy name, hypochondriasis, is where people look for signs of serious illness. Okay, if you've ever looked at you get a bump on your arm or you get a bruise or something, and you're like, I'm dying, aren't I? I need to go to the doctor for this. No, you got a bruise. You hit yourself too hard in the middle of the night, but you're going to be fine. Hypochondriacs will take that and go, no, I'm dying. It is most often found in young adults. Okay, so young people tend to have hypochondria far more than older people do. And it is something that occurs equally in both men and women. Okay, so this isn't something that is just kind of like, oh yeah, women are such hypochondriacs. No, we all are. Now, WebMD, when it came around in the late 90s, I guess, became the hypochondriac's best friend and also the doctor's worst enemy, because now a hypochondriac can take, oh, I've got a bruise on my arm and I didn't hit myself. Why am I bruising? And they can go and put that into WebMD, and WebMD will come up with literally everything that could possibly cause bruising. I'm a hemophiliac. That's what it is. I've got hemophilia. No, you don't. Well, I developed it. No, you didn't. Well, it's something like that. It's not. You had a bruise. People get minor bruises all the time. It's just a thing that human beings have. It is what it is. When I was, oh God, this was probably about 13, 14 years ago, I remember I just wasn't feeling well. And I took my temperature and I had a fever and I had a really bad sore throat. And so I'm like, well, it's too late to go to the doctor's office because they're all closed. So let me check WebMD. Let me see what they have to say. And I put in my symptoms and it came back. Because one of the reasons why WebMD is so horrible is it always puts the thing that could kill you at the top. Okay, even if it's something that like 4 people on the entire planet have this, but we're going to tell you about it, they put it up on the top. And I remember looking at it and going, oh my God, WebMD says I might have meningitis. Now, for those of you who don't remember meningitis from when we talked about it way back at the beginning of the year with the movie Awakenings, meningitis is a viral or bacterial infection of your brain and your spinal cord. And because your brain and your spinal cord don't have any white blood cells to fend off invaders, it causes you to die very quickly. Like, you need to be treated immediately if you get meningitis. Okay. So as I'm looking at this and I'm looking at the symptoms, I'm like, I have that, I have that, I have that. Oh my God, I have meningitis. I'm going to die. Should I go to the hospital now, or what should I do? So then as I kept reading, it eventually said how to tell if you have meningitis. I'm like, yes, tell me. How do I know? Well, you need a fever. Got it. You have a sore throat. Got it. You feel fatigued all the time. Okay, here's the last one. Can you touch your chin to your chest? I don't know, why does that make any difference? Well, when you touch your chin to your chest, you're pulling on your spinal cord. And if you have meningitis, it is excruciating to do that. So much so that it's just, I can't do it. And so after I read that, I immediately tried to get my chin as far down my chest as was possible. I didn't have meningitis. So then I went back to the list of things that could be wrong with me, and I saw the next thing on the list and went, oh, strep throat. I got strep. Okay. Whew, not going to die. Went to the doctor. They gave me some antibiotics, and I lived to tell the tale. Now, fast forward a few years later, this was about 10 years ago, I got sick like the third week of the school year. I got like really sick. I don't usually get very sick, but this one was bad. And I went to the doctor's office and they did a strep test and it came back negative, but I still felt like crap and I had a little fever and it was just not good. And I went back to the doctor, 2 days later I'm like, I'm not getting any better. I've been taking the antibiotics you gave me and I don't feel any better. So they tested me again. It's like one of those long Q-tips and they jam it down your throat. Yeah, I hate that. I have a really strong gag reflex. Basically, anything past my teeth, I'm either swallowing completely or I'm going to throw up. Anyway, so I'm at the doctor's office up in Lancaster, and I'm sitting there, and this nurse comes in to tell me that the strep test came back negative. You don't have strep throat. Yeah, I know that. You just gave me the test 2 days ago. I wouldn't have developed it in the last 2 days. And then the nurse did something which scared the hell out of me. He looked at me and he's like, do you have a lot of sexual partners? And I looked at him, I said, no. I mean, hello? Not a lot of people lining up for this. And the nurse went, okay, never mind. It's nothing. It's nothing. And after he left, I sat there and I went, why would he ask me that? Do I have AIDS? So I got my phone out and I start looking up the symptoms of AIDS and a low-grade fever. I have that. Sore throat. I have that. Fatigue. I have that. I started freaking myself out to the point where I actually went back to a different doctor later that day and got an AIDS test just in case. I still remember when the doctor called me to give me the results. She calls me up and I answer and she's like, okay, so we got the results from your AIDS test, your HIV test. I'm like, okay. And she's like, do you want the results of your AIDS test? I don't know. Do I? Let me put it to you this way. I wouldn't be able to give you a positive result over the phone. Do you want your AIDS test results? Yes. No, you don't have HIV. Oh, thank God. Turns out it was like mono or something like that. The fact is that after a week, I still felt like crap, but I was getting better. It was just a virus. But hypochondria will take anything, and try to find a big thing that they can make out of it. They are both loved and despised by doctors. Loved because they are the ones who are paying for that doctor's boat, but despised because they won't leave them alone. Just go away. Just go away. You're fine. You got a bruise. You're not a hemophiliac. You're okay. Okay? So, really hate that male nurse. Seriously. Scare the living bejesus out of me. Make me think I had AIDS. Do you have a lot of sexual partners? Huh? Not a good day as I remember it. still remember. Do you want me to give you the results? I don't know, do you? I couldn't give you a positive result over the phone. Then yes. You don't. Then why am I sick? We don't know. Oh, okay. That's kind of my experience with doctors. They never know why I'm sick or not feeling well. They just kind of go, it could be a cold. I don't know. Anyway, so leaving psychosomatic and somatoform disorders, we move on to dissociative disorders. And this is where things start getting a little bit more interesting. Okay. Dissociative disorders are disorders where a person experiences alterations in memory, identity, or consciousness. This is going to include a couple of different disorders that we'll talk about. Some of, I don't want to say the more popular ones. Dissociative disorders are really, really rare. Okay. A lot of adults get anxiety disorders. A lot of people suffer from somatoform and psychosomatic disorders. Dissociative disorders are pretty rare. They don't happen all that often. They include things like amnesia and multiple personality disorder, which we'll both talk about in just a sec here. So the first one that we're going to talk about is dissociative amnesia. Now, we talked about amnesia with regard to brain damage when we talked about remembering, and also the parts of the brain itself. But dissociative amnesia has no explanation that goes along with it. There's no biological explanation for why you can't access those memories. Okay. Typically, it has to do with blotting out of painful experiences. People could, I don't want to say suffer from, but they could develop dissociative amnesia because of an assault. That they just don't remember anything that happened, during the assault, even though they were there and conscious and aware and awake and alive. Total amnesia itself is incredibly rare. Now, this is oftentimes used as a really lame plot device in soap operas. They wake up with amnesia and they don't remember who they are. It's not really a thing. Typically, you blot out small parts of your memory. Freud called this repression, okay, repressing those memories into the unconscious. Today, we call it dissociative amnesia, and it's basically used as a tool to help deal with trauma, okay, much like all of the rest of the dissociative disorders. Okay, so it's, again, memory loss with no explanation. We've looked at your brain. You don't have any trauma. You didn't hurt yourself. We don't know why you can't remember, an entire month of your life. And the next dissociative disorder, I believe, is one that was actually removed from the DSM with the last revision, but I'm still going to tell you about it because I believe they kind of put it under something else. But we called it dissociative fugue, or a fugue state. Now, this is amnesia, so you forget things, coupled with active flight from the situation. So you forget who you are and then you leave. Okay. A person with dissociative fugue would experience kind of a blackout, and then they would wake up not knowing who they are in a place that they've never been before. So it'd be like waking up tomorrow in Salt Lake City. How did I get here? Where is here? Who am I? Okay. You can still remember a lot of stuff about, how to talk, how to, what to do at a red light, things like that. But you don't remember your own name, and you don't remember where you live, and you've actively fled from that situation. Again, it can lead you to establish a new identity. Okay, you might have left as Kevin, but then you show up in Salt Lake City, and now you're Larry. Okay, because I don't know who I am. Who do you think I am? Well, you look like my Uncle Larry. I'm Larry. Okay. Again, it involves the repression of past knowledge and memory, and can last from days until decades. Now, here's the thing about dissociative fugue. Again, I'm pretty sure that it was removed from the DSM with the last revision a couple of years ago. I think they revised it in like 2010. But don't quote me on that. Anyway, what they found, and the reason why they removed it, was that most of the people who were suffering from dissociative fugue weren't. They were just trying to leave a traumatic situation that they had no control over. So it wasn't a mental disorder that did it. It was themselves. And then they just pretended, I don't know who I am. I'm Larry now. So an example of that actually comes from the TV show Breaking Bad. There's an episode, I believe it's in the first season, where Walter White is basically just about to get caught cooking meth. And so in order to escape so that he doesn't, he isn't associated with cooking meth and he can actually kind of get away with it, he pretends to have dissociative fugue by going to a convenience store, and he starts walking around the convenience store. And as he's walking around, he's stripping off his clothes. And then when he gets to the front of the store, he's like, I don't know who I am or how I got here. And he pretends to be in a fugue state. They take him to the hospital. They evaluate him. He manages to trick the psychologists into believing that he does, in fact, have dissociative fugue, and he's able to walk away a free man. Okay. Again, that's not really a thing, but thank you, Hollywood. Anyway, the last thing that we're going to be talking about today is probably, I would say, the most popular of the dissociative disorders. And by popular, I mean something that's mentioned a lot when it comes to TV and film and things like that. And that's dissociative identity disorder. Now, dissociative identity disorder is oftentimes referred to as multiple personality disorder. This is where two or more distinct identities form out of a single person. Typically, these different personalities will have control at different times. And typically, it has to do with some kind of trauma that they have experienced at some point in their life. Now, a number of years ago, we had a school psychologist on campus. We still have school psychologists, but we had one that was had a private practice of her own in East Texas, I believe she said. And she came into my psychology classes to talk about her experiences as a licensed psychologist. And one of the things that she talked about was how she treated people with dissociative identity disorder. What she found was, in her experience, and this is not a part of the DSM, but in her experience, the people who suffered from DID did so because they had experienced some kind of sexual assault or sexual trauma as a child. Now, the psychological explanation as to what dissociative identity disorder is and does is your mind shatters your personality into a lot of little pieces, and each little piece becomes its own person to help shield the overall person from the trauma that they are experiencing. Now, we all dissociate at some point. Okay, daydreaming technically is dissociating. You're kind of in your own little world. That's dissociating. Dissociative identity disorder is where you are off in your own world and another part of your personality takes over. And that's what this psychologist, the school psychologist, had experienced. She was having a therapy session with somebody, and about an hour after the session was over, she gets a phone call, and it's a person she doesn't recognize, or at least the name of them, but their voice is familiar. And they gave them a different name and were yelling at them about, how dare you talk about this, and how dare you that, and how dare you this. Turns out it was one of their alternate personalities. Pretty crazy. Not crazy. Interesting. Pretty interesting when you think about it. Now, some people have used its dissociative identity disorder as an excuse to be able to do that. Some people have faked their way through it. I don't know if we're going to see it or not. I haven't really decided. We might not. But there's a movie that we might watch. We might not. Like I said, I haven't decided. That's going to talk about that. And it's, I don't want to say frightening, but it is pretty frightening when you think about it. So, this is where we're going to stop for today, because the next thing to get into is schizophrenia, and there is way too much to talk about with regard to schizophrenia for the next 6 minutes. So we're going to stop it here. Do you have any questions about anything that we've talked about so far? And again, please feel free to ask questions. I can try to answer them. I might even have an answer for them. Got any questions? No? Okay. If you do develop any questions, you can email me. Make sure that you do that. Again, office hours are from 1 to 2 o'clock. Same as they always are. They'll be online. If you weren't here on Thursday to take the test, get the test made up, okay? Office hours, that's when you do that. If you don't have any other questions, I don't have any more answers for you. So let's stop the recording.